Good morning, friends. In yesterday's sermon, we considered the death of John the Baptist, and featuring large in that story, of course, is Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great. He's the one who imprisoned John according to the wishes of his wife Herodias, and also the one who put John to death based on the schemes of his wife Herodias. And what I'd like to do this morning is consider this person, Herod Antipas, and look at his life, particularly as it is revealed in the story of John's death, and then see how a particular proverb, Proverbs 13:15 to be precise, how this particular proverb explains the life of Herod quite well. Because in Proverbs 13:15 we read, "Good sense wins favor, but the way of the treacherous is their ruin." Now that's how the English Standard Version renders the verse, and there's nothing wrong with it at all, of course, but I actually do quite appreciate the simplicity of the King James Version as well, which states, "Good understanding giveth favor, but the way of the transgressors is hard." And it is, of course, that concluding statement that really jumps out at us as we think about Herod. The way of the treacherous is their ruin. The way of transgressors is hard. The idea clearly put forth by both translations, of course, is basically the same point of Paul's words in Romans 6:23 when he writes, "For the wages of sin is death." What does treachery against God produce? What does transgression against God's law produce? What does sin produce? Ultimately, nothing but death, destruction, and hardship. And with that in mind, let's consider the life of Herod from this story and with a few other tidbits added from what we know from other historians, secular historians even, because I mentioned yesterday that Herod and Herodias, quote unquote, fell in love while both were already married. And I say quote unquote fell in love because I don't know what kind of love they actually had, because I don't know if either of them were capable of anything really like love. But again, that's not for me to say, I suppose. But in any case, apparently Herod's first wife, the daughter of Aretas, the king of the Nabatean Arabs, she discovered what was going on, and instead of waiting for Herod to either divorce her or to get rid of her in some other way, she fled back to her father, the king of the Nabatean Arabs. Well, her father was none too happy with how Herod was treating his daughter, and so Aretas invaded Herod's lands and laid such a shellacking on Herod that Rome itself had to come to the rescue. So Herod's wicked choice of discarding his legitimate wife in such a manner had some pretty significant consequences to it. Why? Because the way of the treacherous is their ruin. He set himself up in his wickedness. But then, of course, Herod and Herodias did get married after Herodias divorced Herod's brother Philip, and you can only imagine how strained the relationship would have been between brothers there. But in any case, Herod got what he wanted. He got Herodias. But what did he get in Herodias? Well, a mean-spirited, manipulative, and vindictive source of all sorts of trouble. In fact, well after the events of Matthew 14, Herodias convinced Herod to go to Rome and sue for the full title of king, not just tetrarch, in Israel. Herodias wanted that extra status, and so she cajoled Herod into going to Rome to appear before the emperor and get his due. Well, what happened? Instead of being awarded, he was banished because he had made so many enemies along the way that there was a conspiracy against him wherein the emperor was convinced that Herod was in league with the enemies of Rome. And so instead of having their position elevated in Israel, both Herod and his wife Herodias were banished and stripped of their titles. Why? Because the way of the transgressor is hard. And even if we just think of the immediate context of the story of Herod's birthday banquet and the execution of John, which was something that Herod didn't actually want to have happen, we again ask, why did it happen? Because Herod was caught up in sin, the sinful lifestyle and activity of just pleasing his own passions, which led to drunkenness and the foolishness that goes with that, as well as letting his sensual desires motivate his actions. And so he makes a foolish and rash oath, a sinful vow motivated by sinful desires, and this opened him up wide to being taken advantage of by the sinful desires and demands of Herodias. So that in the end, he felt trapped and went through with doing the very thing he didn't actually want to do. Why? Because sin leads to destruction, and compounded sin leads to even more destruction. It just gets intensified, and the consequences just get that much worse. It's like that bit of wisdom we all hopefully learned as a kid, which is you shouldn't tell even one lie, because then you've got to tell another lie to cover up for the first lie, and then another lie to cover up for that lie, until you're basically just living a lie and everything is falling apart around you. And this comes from that biblical principle that the way of the transgressor is hard. Because we can all think of scenarios either in our own lives, and I'm not free from this myself. I can look back and consider what I've done in my life and what I still struggle with today. Or we consider the lives of those around us where everything is falling apart. And we or that person just stands there baffled, wanting to cry, not understanding why things are going so bad. Now, as we talked about in yesterday's message, sometimes things go bad from an earthly perspective. Sometimes we have to suffer, even though we're doing the right thing. But thankfully, the scriptures are clearly spell it out for us. And so when that's the case, we can quickly identify that that's the case and be encouraged, even in the midst of the difficulty. But there are times when a person's life is just falling apart and they're at a complete loss. But, you've been listening to them complain about their relationships or what they're doing in their lives. They've seen how they live their lives. And so they're breaking down, but you know exactly why things are as hard for them and as bad for them as they are. Because the world would go as far as saying that the person has made some bad choices or they've made some mistakes. And this is not to break anyone down. It's just that you have to know what the problem is before it can be fixed. And the truth is that things are as bad as they are for this person because they've not just made mistakes or bad choices or even just simply unwise choices. They've made a whole string of sinful choices that have rebelled against God, that have transgressed his law. And when you reject that which pertains to life and health and goodness, which in turn produces joy and comfort and strength and happiness, well, if you reject that and actually go in the opposite direction, little wonder that life is hard, that relationships break down, that finances always seem to be a struggle, that purpose and meaning seem so hard to hold on to, because good sense wins favor, but the way of the treacherous is their ruin. And so let each one of us consider the state of our own lives. Again, there will be difficulties in every life, for sure. But we can look at those difficulties and we can ask, where are these difficulties coming from? Are they simply the product of living in a sinful world? Because, of course, sometimes we do suffer just because of the sin of other people, and that might be the case. Though we should be very careful about just jumping to that conclusion and blaming our hardships on everyone else by default. We need to be honest. Or are we suffering for the sake of righteousness? In which case we can be comforted that a reward does await us in heaven for this. Or do we have to admit upon this honest self-examination that we are simply reaping the consequences of our own sinful actions, because sin will, by its very nature, break down and destroy whatever it comes near to? So let's be honest in this time of self-examination, such that we can live a good and godly day today. And with that, I pray, Lord willing, to see you soon.